But what you've made me do is want to go back to the beginning
Mhm.
because you said the 1880s. So let's talk about your family's foundation in the area. Which side came first, your mother's side or your father's side?
Well, it's my father's side of the family came to East St. Louis through his mother. And her grandfather, I don't know when Elizabeth Beasley came, her grandmother, but her grandfather was listed in the 1870s. I think he came in the 1860s, but he's already in the city directories in the 1870s. And he was a
And
Pullman porter.
what was his name again?
His name was Martin Hawkins, and then somehow it turned to Morton. Don't ask me, that's one of the biggest things he named his first son, one of his sons, Morton Jr., but he was Martin Hawkins. He, just to go back just a bit because it's kind of interesting, he
Mhm.
was born enslaved in Kentucky. His father was his master. And in Kentucky, Kentucky was a strange state during that time. In 1864, it was part of the Union still, even though it was a slave state. So they never could meet Lincoln's quotas for enlistment. So what the government did was offer slave masters money to for their slaves to enlist in the Civil War. So his father, his master, father master, was paid $400, which is $15,000 in today's dollars, for him to enlist in the 122nd U.S. Negro colored troops infantry. So after the war, he was mustered out and he went to East St. Louis.
Mm,
I never really understood, and I haven't been told specifically, but I think he went there to become a Pullman porter. And the Pullman porters, the reason that they were all black and is because they were mainly formerly enslaved people, and that they felt that they knew how to serve people. I'm assuming. I know my great great grandfather was educated. He knew how to read and write, and he was educated. But he also knew how to serve because he probably served in the house, being the father, the master's child.
mhm,
So he went to East St. Louis to become a Pullman porter, but he built a 13-room house in a few decades in um, on St. Louis Avenue. He had businesses, his children had businesses. He was a political broker. If you read Charles Lumpkin's American Program, it talks about how he was one of the people who would um, get votes for from the black community to the white, whatever, Republican or Democrat. He wasn't aligned with any one party. But that also, he was able to bring civil servants' jobs back and certain privileges back to the black community, of which he took advantage of some himself. So he was very politically involved. And I think he was a great striver. I think that he was very devoted to the black community, what they would call a race man at that time. But at that time, I think he also, with everything that he had gone through, he saw possibilities. And
mhm,
East St. Louis was one of those places, even after Reconstruction, where black people could still vote.
mhm. Wow. I mean, he sounds like such a compelling figure, Mr. Morton Beasley, correct?
No, he was not Beasley. He was Morton Hawkins.
Morton Hawkins. Morton
His
Hawkins
wife was Elizabeth
was
Beasley.
Elizabeth Beasley. Okay.
Her father was white too. Came from Cape Girardeau, Missouri. I know her father was a doctor. The family lore is that he and his wife came from the Carolinas and they got married in the Catholic Church because some priests would marry black people with white people, interracial couples at that time. And she somehow ended up in East St. Louis too. And they got married and they had many, many children. I was able to find her obituary, which was in the paper, and she was credited with, while he was, I guess, making money, she was very involved in education and doing a lot for the education of Black children in East St. Louis. So they got there in the 18, my great grandmother was born in 1860, 73, 4, something like that.
Okay.
So they had been there for a while before then, before she was born. And she was educated too. Her siblings were educated. They ended up having this theater called the Olympic Theater
Mm-hmm.
on I can't remember the street, but it's now a Gas and Go.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a movie theater. They brought the Nickelodeon projections. They owned a barber shop. They owned a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
They owned, they ended up having a lot of businesses that the Hawkins did. And it's because of Martin Hawkins, I think his political patronage, which I believe, I don't have any proof of this, but why my great grandfather, his son-in-law, was able to get the job as a detective on the police force,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
served under for in 1917.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I love the coming together and the diversity of the two sides of the family. We have Kentucky, formerly enslaved, one of the enlisted colored infantry that saved us. I really was just reading about how it was a general rebellion. I'm almost quoting word for word at the end of the Civil War that is credited with turning the tide toward the Union.
Yes. Hmm.
And so enlisted men, enslaved folks just coming out of the fields, taking up arms, whatever that meant, and liberating us. And I'm so, so grateful to people like your ancestor who, did what it took to put that final nail in the coffin of enslavement.
Well, I think to a large degree, and this is not just the people who fought in the Civil War, but Black people who come from chattel slavery in this country, they are indigenous to this nation. They're not indigenous to the land like Native American people are. But this nation was formed with Black people at, you know, building the Capitol,
Mm-hmm.
doing everything. So I feel like that their spirit was in the spirit of how people approached building a Black community in East St. Louis and so many other places. But
Mm-hmm.
certainly we're talking about East St. Louis here. So just I think that just the richness of my grandmother when she talked about East St. Louis, she loved East St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
Now she never talked about the massacre, but she loved East St. Louis. So I have to feel like there was a real richness and togetherness of the Black community there.
I feel what you're saying. I mean, I've even heard um folks from East St. Louis, I'm a dual citizen, but folks who are native to the area call other East St. Louisans the East St. Louis diaspora, almost like it's a small African country.
I'm
And they
starting to feel that. I
and
feel
they
like a diasporan.
yes, yes, and they claim that they can notice one another. You know how when you meet Nigerians, they say, "Oh, that person is from my country." Oh, that person is Igbo. I know you are Igbo. That's how East St. Louisans are.
That's
They
wonderful.
saying something about the accent, the walk, the cut of the shoulder. I don't know what it is, but it's deep.
Well, I think East St. Louis, because she had roots there. So I grew up in Detroit. I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and grew up in Detroit. And certainly they say something about Detroiters too. They have that attitude. So I think my grandmother fit right in.
Mm,
I think that that's probably why Detroit really appealed to her because it's a radical attitude too. It's a pride in being Black, and a particular type of pride. My grandmother was a very proud, white-looking Black woman. I mean, she was very proud to be a Black person, and she raised us. She raised her children to be proud of being Black,
mm-hmm,
and which it fits right in with Detroit. She also, I looked at what school she taught at. She taught at Dunbar.
mm-hmm,
Like the way back when she was teaching in 1918, maybe, at Dunbar was named after Paul Laurence Dunbar.
mm-hmm.
I mean, we're changing schools now to have Confederate names that Black people went to. The fact that East St. Louis was ahead of the game and already had schools named after Black heroes, I think says something about East St. Louis. And it makes me proud, even though I never grew up there or visited there as a child. I mean, I think I went once. My grandparents, my great grandparents were dead. I never met many of her siblings that lived there. I do feel like it's a part of me and it's certainly a part of who I am. So I do think there is a diaspora.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, generationally, those our ancestors right after the Civil War, they were just like superheroes,
Okay.
right?
Right.
In collaboration with well-meaning white allies, they founded every HBCU. They founded the NAACP, the Urban League, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. I mean, all kinds of mutual aid societies and, faith denominations. Like every institution we have that we trust almost was founded by that group of people. So they were just incredible. And that they would have to endure the insult of these attempted pogroms, these attempted racial cleansings is just, it's breathtaking in the way that it galls you. But let's move forward. Let's move forward in history.
Okay.
So we have a foundational ancestor from Kentucky, foundational ancestor coming up from what is southern Missouri, Cape Girardeau,
Mhm.
and coming together in East St. Louis, starting a family. And is it one of his sons? You said his son-in-law become.
Daughter, yeah, Belle, my great grandmother's name was Belle, and
Okay.
she was one of his, she married John Eubanks Sr.,
Mm-hmm.
who became the detective, later on. But when they got married in the 1800s, and my grandmother is one of their children. So it was his son-in-law, um,
Okay.
John Eubanks, who was involved directly. Now, Martin Hawkins at that time, when in the congressional testimony,
Mm-hmm.
it says that the first thing he did, if I mean, you do know better than I do. 628 East St. Louis, I mean, St. Louis Avenue is around the corner from Lincoln School, the
Mm-hmm.
first Lincoln School.
Mm-hmm.
2 blocks down St. Louis Avenue is where everything started for
Mm-hmm.
that day on the second. It's where the speeches were being given so he was going to work when he noticed something. And this is according to his testimony. So he went back home,
So
got
we're on July 1st,
July 2nd,
July 2nd,
right?
1917.
Right. And he noticed something was happening. So the first thing he did before he went to work, which made me fall in love with him, I didn't know, we never met, but it made me fall in love with him for real, is he went and got his family. He knew something was going to happen, not to go through the whole history, but stuff had been happening since May. And so he knew, and he had the instinct of being a detective too, of knowing when something was about to pop off. So he went and got his family and he took them to the Free Bridge. Among those people he took to the Free Bridge was my grandmother, his wife, his other children, and Morton Hawkins, because Morton Hawkins was a frail man then. Oh man, he died in 1918. And so he escorted them. As he's leaving the Free Bridge, he comes across one group of about 32 Black women and children. And they asked him to escort them to safety because
Mm-hmm.
I can only imagine they knew he was a police officer because it's a small town. Everybody knows everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so they asked him to escort him, and he did before reporting to work because he said that their husbands were on those 12-hour shifts at the factories, and they wouldn't even know anything was starting to happen. So he escorted one group and then another group. And then he went to work. And then he was talking to, according to this testimony, the mayor and the chief of detectives. And I'm like, so when I went to the Belleville Historical Society, I'm like, why is the mayor talking to my great grandfather? And somehow he was at the center of things. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know why he was at the center of things, but it's a long story, but he was at the center of things. And then they were trying to send him into areas where there were a bunch of um white crowds, like 80 or more people, mobs. And he said he didn't go into the mob. And so they were critical of him in this testimony because what I get out of reading the whole thing is they were trying to make it like it was a gang collision. Like there were the white mobs and the black mobs. And he would not say that there was a black mob.
So they were trying to say there were good people on both sides. Remember when certain person said that about Charleston?
He was trying to say that, and what he did not want it to be was that because remember at the time, the United States, because this is a congressional hearing, we were trying to promote, this democracy all over the world, and people were laughing at us. There were headline stories all over the world about this. And they were like, well, how can President Wilson be promoting democracy over the world and chastising us when they don't even treat their own people right? Look how they're treating their own people. And it was particularly horrific. And as you have all of the white people, even some of the white papers were like horrified. But then you also have W.E.B. Du Bois coming in for the crisis, and you have Ida B. Wells coming in from her group in Chicago. So they were trying to reframe what happened in East St. Louis into this, oh, white people and black people don't like each other, so here's this collision. And he
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't do it. I mean, that's why there are 91 pages of testimony because they kept trying to. And at first I was like, why is he being so dodgy? Because he wasn't answering their questions.
Mm-hmm.
But he was only not answering their questions because he knew they wanted him to name names. He knew, and at one point they even said to him when he said he wouldn't go into a crowd, well, for the record, you're a mulatto, right? Trying to divide,
Mm-hmm.
like not having none of that.
Mm-hmm.
But they actually put that in the congressional hearing.
Right, right. So
Then they kept,
you guys want to hint at me being mixed now, but I bet if we looked at my salary, I wouldn't have, the same salary as you during
they
this
wouldn't let him
time.
wear a uniform. The only
Right,
reason
exactly.
was, man, they just because they didn't want them in uniform. He knew, and everybody knows when you're in a small town, I don't care what your complexion was, one drop rule, you are a black man.
Exactly.
He knew he was a black man. Those people in those crowds knew he was a black man. And this was, they were trying everything that they could to reframe things. And it was just it felt like some of the Trump hearings. I mean, it really did when I was reading it. And what it did for me was the more things change, the more things stay the same. And white supremacy is white supremacy.
It's so true. And I here's what's fascinating. This sort of circular hamster wheel that white supremacy has the US on. There's an incident, and then there's a congressional inquiry, a hearing. They bind it all up in a book and put it on a shelf. They don't use any of the lessons from it. And then a few years later, there's an incident. And we start all back over. And we've been doing this for now 200 years.
Well,
We've been doing something like it for 200 years.
they're trying to repeal the 14th and 15th Amendments right now. They really are trying, or actually 14th Amendment. They're trying to really, they're trying to really break any kind of progress that Black people and Indigenous people have had in getting a racial reckoning. And when we've actually started drawing blood, is when they start acting like fools. And we're in one of those cycles right now. But also, you can't forget the fact that historically, when they talk about the Red Summer, 1917 is 2 years after Birth of a Nation. And and so a lot of what happened was, a precursor to what you're going to see later on with Red Summer. But East St. Louis was too prosperous. They were voting still, and I'm talking about Black people. And Black people were finding ways to have impact on the government. And so it was an ethnic cleansing. And it wasn't just, I think that the thing to remember, I think Charles Lumpkin is very um, adept at explaining this. This East St. Louis was founded by the Morgans, by the robber barons, by the Carnegies, those people. This was not just an uprising of people coming from Eastern Europe and resenting people. This was actually saying, I think these people have got too much power. They were useful in the beginning. We don't need them anymore. We don't want them here. We're going to get rid of them.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the historical document. I can't remember if it is the Chamber of Commerce, a businessman, an industrialist. It's on letterhead, and it's basically a meeting calling all the white men together because, quote unquote, the long time resident black people and colored people, that's not who we're talking about. It's this influx of new ones that we've got to, address. And I thought to myself, what is really happening here? And you're right. It's basically racialized capitalism.
Absolutely.
We
And
always think yeah.
capitalism is always racialized,
Mm-hmm.
either racialized from a national basis or a colonial basis. But capitalism is always racialized. They came up at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
At least the form of capitalism that we experience now in the world, it was always racialized.
Mm-hmm. And I'm convinced that that the people who make the most money, who take the most resources, and have had time to study the signals, like you said, when you said you can tell we're drawing blood when they start to act a fool. The enemies of good and the capitalists, they study the signals, and I think there are moments where they can tell, oh, okay, they're about to slip over into class consciousness. Okay, if we continue to let this happen, those Lithuanians and other Eastern Europeans, I saw them going to the black woman's cart buying collards. I saw them at the going into the juke joint and they didn't get kicked out. I saw them standing out having a cigarette with the shoe shine guys. Uh-oh.
You can be the
let's
Bacon
let's not
Rebellion.
let's not have some class solidarity here. We gotta interject them. Don't forget you white. Don't forget you a cut above. Don't forget you better and keep
Or
that
that you're almost white. You
right.
prove yourself and you get white.
Yes.
Almost white. I mean, and then and so it's not for people that don't understand that race is a social construct. They may
Mm,
be confused. But my mother told me when she was growing up in the 40s and 50s in Detroit that Italian people and Jewish people and Greek people were not white.
mm-hmm,
Now they weren't black, but they were not white.
mm,
And I think that so we also have to look at that whole trend. But you can go back to the Bacon Rebellion anytime people start getting together and see where um, you have black people and white people of the same class starting to get together, and it's a threat to the powers that be
mm,
because we want to make racism and racial violence low class because we don't want people to be aware that the people who are perpetuating or stoking the fires for this kind of racial violence are really protecting their billions.
mm-hmm. That's right. And that's everyone involved is protecting the billions. But back to your incredible ancestors. So you said that morning before the real peak of the violence, he had already helped a group of women and children. He had gotten his elderly father-in-law, his wife and his children over the Free Bridge. Do you know where they went in St. Louis to
I
kind of
don't,
like lay low?
and I don't know if I ever will. There's so much in books and that I can see, like, this is a treasure trove of information.
Mm-hmm.
And when we first spoke, I hadn't seen this. I
Mm.
think I got it like maybe a week after when we first connected because it's on ProPublica now. But I hadn't gone, I would have had to go to the Library of Congress and find the archives there. But it really changes everything. I was so glad to have it before I went there because then I could actually trace his steps in East St. Louis.
Mm-hmm. And for those listening, she is referring to the congressional testimonial record. Uh,
Yeah, this was from Friday, October 26, 1917.
yes. And my sense is it yeah, you can definitely pick out from the line of questioning the just intense racial hierarchies that existed during that time. I can't remember her name. She was a survivor. Her picture is very signature because she was shot and became an amputee.
I remember.
And there's that moment in the congressional testimony where they're questioning her. And I'm sure she showed up, of course, to the testimony missing an arm, which is quite uncanny for us humans, no matter our race. And I could see through the questioning that they were having trouble uh, accepting that that she had done nothing to draw the ire. They keep asking like, "Did you have a gun? Did you run toward them? Did you make any movement?" She's like, "No, I just walked outside and when I saw all of them with guns, I turned to run inside, and that's when my arm was shot off."
Well, and it's also very clear that they don't really care. I mean,
Yes.
it was very clear that they had to do this. There was pressure to do this for multiple reasons, including that interstate commerce was interrupted, and that became a big deal from a
Mhm.
national perspective.
Mhm.
But this was not this just like with many of the inquiries that we've experienced even in our lifetime, this was not because they were outraged by what happened. They knew that that their position in the world was taking a hit and that, there is a tipping point. You know, my grandmother on the other side of my family, not from East St. Louis, she was a communist and she was an activist. And when she was a communist in the 30s, 1930s, that was something that wasn't just her. There were so many people in this country that were communists. And Roosevelt's, um, a lot of Roosevelt's acts did not really have to do with helping Black people. It was how to keep this country a capitalist country.
Mm.
I mean, and so I really feel like we're going to see
Preach.
that cycle again
Preach.
soon. But this was really okay. We studied it. We are a democracy. We've done this. And the report is very interesting too, because what I've read it all now.
Hmm.
A lot of reading. I mean, it was almost like taking a course. But I've read all of it now, and their conclusions were very neutral. They couldn't quite go where they wanted to go with it without being just gross accused of gross hypocrisy. But they really they had the hearings so they could say, "Oh, we had these hearings and we can't, we're not these people are not being hunted and this is not terrorism." And okay, and then like you said, they took it and they put it on a shelf. And for the most part, I'm going to tell you the truth, I've been working on this project very intently for 2 years, but I've been for 10 years I've been like surfacing stuff.
Hmm.
No, but 2 years ago is when I really started focusing on it. And so many people here in New York State have never heard of it. They're just hearing about Tulsa probably because of shows on HBO and stuff like that too. But they have no idea that this happened or that it was as impactful as it was all over the world. That this was something that, like I said, the Crisis magazine talked about all the time, and people went to investigate. But what I've also found is if I Google my great grandfather's name, I get all these dissertations from all over the world popping up because
Mm-hmm.
people also get their doctorates on this,
Mm-hmm.
studying this. So this is not something that, I mean, with what you're doing with these oral history projects and with what the historical society is doing and everything, it's not going to be forgotten, but they want it to be.
I agree. I agree. And there's always an attempt to kind of uh sway history's meaning to in the service of capital. Well, this happened because, black people didn't have enough money and black people should have more money and but your family had businesses. Your family were in the highest professions at the time. They owned theaters. I mean, when you own a theater, you don't just you have interstate commerce because you have to order the Nickelodeon. There's a technician probably that came with it and all. I mean, they were the equivalent of owning a small tech store. You know what I'm saying? When you're at the top of the industrial chain at the time, which is what a Nickelodeon would have been, the technology of the
Well,
time.
they did it in the dirt in a according to tidbits. So the Reginald and Edna Petty, I credit them so much with the little black tidbits because I
Mm.
I took that. That's why oral history projects and getting people's histories is so
Hmm.
critical because I learned so much about my family. I'm like, wait a minute, that's my family, that's my family, that's my family, that's my family, and it gave me things to follow up on. But I don't want to confuse the fact that they were very industrious and they did well with wealth. They were not a wealthy family.
Okay. Okay.
They had a car, which
Yeah.
I guess was a big deal then. Um,
I don't know if I thought they were wealthy. I thought they were well positioned.
they were well positioned and
That's what I would say, well positioned.
they were getting education. My grandmother went
Hmm.
to college. Her sister went to college. Her brother became the president in the NAACP, and John Eubanks Jr., the detective's son, and he was a physician. Gave
Hmm.
Miles Davis's first trumpet. You know,
Hmm.
Miles Davis's autobiography because he and Miles Davis's father were best friends.
Hmm.
And
The
and
dent,
so
because Miles Davis's father was a dentist.
right, they were
So
best
the
friends.
dentist and the phisian, both of them. Okay, I
Go
understand.
back and look in the autobiography. It's pretty. It was a colorful descriptions of relationship. But he called what was my Uncle Johnny. He knew my Uncle Johnny. Uncle Johnny was deceased before I was born, but that
Hmm.
was my mother's brother. Um, Jelly Roll Morton used to go through their house because Horace Eubanks was on his discography. He was on Louis Armstrong's discographies. I mean, they had a very vibrant house of people.
Hmm.
Her sister Gladys, John Eubanks' daughter Gladys, my grandmother's sister, she was in Oscar Micheaux films.
Mm.
So I mean, they were part of the vibrancy of Black life at that time. I
Mhm.
would say it like that. And they were also very industrious. But I told you when we met, what I'm finding is, I knew my family was like that. What I'm finding is there were a whole lot of Black people that were like that. I think that characterized Black people, period, there, and it probably they'd have to be there a couple of years to get their feet on the ground, working whatever jobs. They had a whole lot of Pullman porters who were based there.
Mhm.
There are, there's a documentary that said the Pullman porters built the Black middle class, you know, both
Mhm.
from a communications perspective, but also that, the little money they earn, being able to save it, but being able to communicate north and south with people on
Mhm.
their routes. Plus, the Pullman porters were exposed to so much. So, because they were, even if they were had to be shucking and jiving in the eyes of the people they were serving, they weren't. They were observing everything. They were figuring things out. They were exposed to the possibilities, to
Mm.
different people, to seeing so much. So, my grandmother was very proud of her family, and my grandmother became a socialite in Detroit. But she didn't describe her family that way. She described her family as a very hardworking family, a very close-knit family. But one of the things I also told you was that after the pogrom, the massacre,
Hmm.
Belle Eubanks and John Eubanks divorced.
Now, Eubanks was the detective, correct?
Correct. They divorced. He's divorced.
Interesting.
He stayed on the police force for a couple more years and became a real estate, um, had a lot of real estate. His his out of his retirement letter was published in the paper. It was so weird. I'm like, why is
Mhm.
this black man's retirement being published in the paper? But I think that the white people were scared that people would perceive him as being forced out because he keeps saying, I wasn't forced out. I wasn't forced out, which generally means I was forced out.
Yeah, I was totally forced out.
But my great grandmother, his wife, wanted to go with Garvey to Liberia. She became
Hmm.
a Garveyite. She was like, we have done everything right. We've they said that if we do things like this, then we will start, we'll get some respect for white people. And basically she's like, I don't believe it. I want to go. But she ended up living in Chicago because of course the Star Line did not ever go to Liberia.
Hmm. Hmm.
Became a Garveyite. So I also think that there was a element of radicalism in East St. Louis. Because
Hmm.
what is this woman who's been a housewife all this time living a relatively comfortable lifestyle, I would say. She had people that helped her in the house.
Hmm.
And she's like, bump that, I am going to Liberia.
Mm. Well, I mean, I think the diversity of thought in your family is really a snapshot of the African American kind of political tree, the tree of choices, the branch of choices. Some people, say, well, there's no hope, get out of the South, right? That's what happened with Ida B. Wells after her friends were lynched and her printing press was torched. She went all the way up to New York near you, and that is where the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs gave her money to put together her foundational study, The Red Record, all about lynching. And she used information she got from East St. Louis in there to, kind of inform her statistics, her numbers, all of that. So,
She wrote a pamphlet about East St. Louis too.
she sure did. She sure did. And but then you have some people who say, well, it's a spiritual thing, right? We're going to go deep into AME. AME, a lot of black people charge the church with being the great conciliatory force in the black community, right? They keep us all, thinking about heaven and not thinking about bashing Mister's head in and heaven like but the AME was a radical force, had spots on the Underground Railroad. So you have all these people. Then we have people like your grandmother, the Garveyite,
Great grandmother.
great grandmother, the Garveyite, and in the UNIA and everything.
Well, Morton Hawkins, I mean, Morton Hawkins, her father he was a race man, and so she was actually exhibiting some of, I think, his um the same thing he did when he came to East St. Louis, and
Mhm.
her husband was not. But that's still, he was still radical. I mean, when you read the testimony, he was still radical. It's just not as radical. But
Mhm.
there also was something that I'm very proud of and very curious about and am studying more, is the impetus for Black people in East St. Louis to arm themselves. They were not going to lie down and take whatever was coming to them. And that was one of the things that from the white supremacist perspective might say that, oh, this is why we did this, because they were shooting into a car. No, I'm in love with all of them. I
Mm-hmm.
feel so indebted to them that they actually, and I'm not blaming people who don't arm themselves. I don't have a gun,
Mm-hmm.
but just the fact that they were going to protect each other, that the Mutual Aid Society also meant the Mutual Protection Society.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things about white supremacy is it fits all of us into these kind of character slots, these stock characters. So black people are just supposed to have history enacted upon us. We're just supposed to be passive recipients who either are saved or killed, who either get to be the monster or the redemptive one. It's all very binary. So I think when those black people were sick, according to the vernacular history of white people coming through the neighborhood, rousting their porches, shooting into their homes. One of the descendants that I interviewed, Mr. Kennedy, said that his great grandfather told him that they were walking the children to school even before the height of the pogrom happened because people were taking pot shots at the children. So
Right.
when you think about those ancestors shooting back at a car coming through unmarked, nobody has on a policeman's uniform, and they unfortunately or fortunately succumb to their injuries, I don't feel anything. But that's what you get.
That's right. And the fact that and just the viciousness and the of everything that happened. I mean, I don't want to um spend a whole lot of time on this, but the viciousness
Ooh,
and the participation of white men, white women, and white children,
that part.
and actually pulling people off of streetcars and burning people alive. I mean, burning people that are alive, all of those kind of things. It's vicious, making fun of people as you're pulling them off of their bodies and everything.
Mhm.
And then having survivors go back and see white women in their clothes.
That one took me down through there. So listeners, she Rachel is referring to this one oral history that was it taken down by Ida B. Wells?
I think so.
Was it taken down by Ida B. Wells
In
where she
her
said
pamphlet. Uh-huh.
she came back, the person who had been who was a victim of the who had to flee, and she came back to her home to see what else she might recover, even though there had been fires and white people looting, blah blah blah, and the neighbor had on her dress just as plain
Yeah,
as day.
it's
And
fur.
when
I
she
think it was
approached
fur
her about,
too.
huh?
I think it was a fur too, or something like
She
that.
had on the dress, and when she approached her about it, she said, "Well, everybody else was doing it,
Right. And to me, that indicates envy. And I think
girl."
that
That
the,
part.
I think the thing about it is that when you're researching this and when you're reading about it and everything, to not put it all on the same level.
Mm,
People entered into the massacre where they came from. So
mm,
it does not negate because she was scavenging people's stuff, does not mean that Morgan and Carnegie and those kind of people did not influence what happened. It does
mm,
not mean that the Union was not contributing to anti-blackness. The
mm,
leaders of the was it Gompers? I
mm.
mean, so these are people that I know I learned in school were heroes from the Union. They also were very anti-black.
Hmm.
It also doesn't mean, and one of the things they discussed in my great grandfather's testimony was the whole unionization versus non-union. And what he said and maintained is that the black people, including Dr. Leroy Bundy, tried to get the unions, tried to have those meetings for black people to become unionized. And the white unions did not want them. So anything you read, anyone listening to this, that says
Hmm.
that black people didn't want to be in unions, that's a lie. They were rejected from unions, or they were offered such a bad deal that it wasn't positive for them to be in the union.
Mhm.
So, but they were people unions. There were people that just hated black people and wanted to follow, like, they wanted to terrorize black people. They
Mhm.
were coming from all different levels. And the powers that be were fomenting this. They were the speech that my great grandfather heard 2 blocks from his home,
Mhm.
where the mob is getting all fired up. It's like a Donald Trump speech.
Mhm.
So, but women and children were involved here. And that's why it's really critical to me that whatever I write or whatever in my research has to include the fact that this was not men behaving badly on their own, white men.
Mhm.
This was and this is the history. Look at the lynching postcards. Look at the children trying to integrate schools and those women.
Mm.
And
Mm.
white women have never taken responsibility to me for their roles in terror of black people.
No, and part of it is, our, when I say our, I mean the culture's ingrained sexism that also wants to, uh, just that doesn't want to give women the full power of their choices. We want to believe that there's always a man pulling the strings. Um, and it's something that I've talked with many sister friends about, white and black. No one's voting against their own interests for 100 years. Stop yourself from having that conversation and asking yourself, now, why would they? Because what you're doing is you're denying that woman her full humanity, as distorted as it is by her anti-black racism. She's making those choices. No man is pulling that lever in the booth for her for 100 years. They voted the same. So some people, and I wish there were a better way, a better term to use, but sometimes I say kamikaze, sometimes I say suicide bomber, just to bring home the strength of when people's project of whiteness supersedes their own survival. They are cognizant of that, just like the kamikaze, just like the suicide bomber is saying, maybe there's 1% of me that hopes this bomb doesn't kill me, but I'm going in knowing that it will because my mission is bigger than me. So I really think we have to accept that about a lot of these white women in these racialized and racial terror situations. They are just as culpable. They're making their own decisions and they are just as culpable. And it is terrifying. It is terrifying as women in particular, anyone who's given birth or mothered in any way, it's hard for us to accept it. But the evidence is there.
Well, I know that the my grandmother went on. She taught a couple years in East St. Louis. She never went back.
Mm-hmm.
Loved it. She taught in Indianapolis. They lived in Chicago. She married my grandfather, and then they lived in Detroit. Her sister Gladys, who was in the Oscar Michaud films, she ended up living in Chicago and Muskegon, Michigan. Her brother stayed. Um, her brother, um, her brother Horace was a musician in Europe, an expatriate
Mm-hmm.
in Europe. I guess one of the things I didn't say that I should probably say here in terms of what was happening in 1917, John Eubanks Jr., the son of the detective, and Horace Eubanks were fighting in Europe. They were in the World War One.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read that more black men from Illinois enrolled or enlisted in the First World War than anywhere else in the country. They were part of that, and they were musicians, but they were part of the battalion that actually went to fight with the French. So all that's happening. So while his father's trying to fight things at home, two of his sons were fighting in Europe
Mm-hmm.
in World War One, which I
I
think,
mean, yeah, the irony is
mhm.
staggering. The irony is staggering. Wow.
And I wonder what I really am trying to research Edward Stanton Hawkins now.
Mm-hmm.
That's so Morton Hawkins, one of his firstborn son, Edward was the first black post officer, postal carrier in East St. Louis.
Mm. Okay.
What was he carrying the mail? I mean, what happens there during? I want to know what he was doing during that time. Did they stop mail service? You know,
Mm.
he was he was he was among the first black, I mean, postal carriers, the first six in East St. Louis, I think were in 1906.
Mm-hmm.
So there was one black man. Again, that's that I think patronage
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
why he was able to get that job, but he was the first black mail carrier.
Mm. Well, so the last ancestor of yours to remain in East St. Louis was the one who was a musician, and then they eventually went to Europe.
No, the last one to remain there was John Eubanks Jr.,
Mm-hmm.
who got married, who was, like I said, he was the head of the president of NAACP at one time in East St. Louis. He was a doctor there for many years. I think he died in 1958. But he was a physician,
Mm.
and so he and his wife Alma stayed in East St. Louis. And my and so did um John Eubanks Sr. was still there.
Mm-hmm.
His wife left him,
Mm-hmm.
and he stayed there.
Hmm.
So my grandmother she would go back. There were things in the paper that would say she's going back, and or her brother was coming from East St. Louis to Detroit to visit her. But I went only once when I was a little girl. We drove through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So after the Eubanks passed away, the
So
physician and his wife, and then his son.
I
His
have
son,
to
yes, go ahead.
I have to take back what I said. You're asking about Eubanks and my grandmother's family. Certainly there were other people there
Okay.
in the greater family, in the Beasleys, the Hickmans.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they don't live in East St. Louis, but Dr. Norvella Hickman is, I guess, my second cousin once removed. She's still there in
Mm-hmm.
the area. Norval Hickman the third, who I corresponded with recently, he lives in San Francisco, but he went to high school he went to school in East St. Louis schools. So the Hickmans a lot of the Hickmans are there, the Beasleys, and there's probably family I don't know that are still there because my family names are Hawkins, Beasley, Hickman, Eubanks.
So as we move to a close, what I was wondering is, did your family pass down stories about the impact of the race massacre? How did you find out that your family were even actors in such a integral way in those events?
I didn't know anything about it. My grandmother never mentioned it to me. She told me all about East St. Louis, the schools, the food, and how much she loved it, having to go up this big hill to school at one point. The winters, the flooding, because when she was born in 1897. That her grandfather, the house on St. Louis Avenue actually was three levels because they had a kitchen on the first level and the second level, so that when it flooded, they would go up. She told me so many things about it and how much she loved it, but she
Mm,
never mentioned anything about that to me. How did I learn about it? Um, I learned about it. It's a kind of a I started, my grandmother she has scrapbooks.
mhm,
And so I knew what her brothers and what her family looked like. And so I was watching Kim Burns' jazz series with my husband, And this is when it first came out, so it was a long time ago. And I said, "That's Uncle Johnny." And my husband said, "That's not your Uncle Johnny." And of course, I was going to find out that I was going to prove him wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So I contacted the photo um, producer for the series, and I found out that it was indeed my Uncle Johnny. And then I found out he was with this man named PG Laurie Bands. And PG Laurie was like a precursor to jazz. I mean, he with the big bands and everything, and he would play at circuses. But that's where a lot of the jazz was played at that time. Longer story than for here.
Mm-hmm.
So as I started looking, because my family's in so many dissertations and books, is I learned it that way. And I actually don't even know if I knew about the massacre
Mm-hmm.
the time that I first started looking. But then, so that's been probably 20 years that I started poking around. And as more and more information became available, I would research it. I had no agenda, just to know. And Ferguson happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I became infuriated that Ferguson's 9 minutes from East St. Louis, and that there was, they would be talking about relationships between the police and Black community, and that there was so little reference to the history. And so I wrote a blog. I think you found the blog. That's how you found me.
Mm-hmm.
I was writing a blog for our Democrat and Chronicle paper at the time, and so I wrote about my grandfather. I didn't even have it all right then. I mean, at this point, Ferguson, what happened in 2015, 2016,
2014.
14.
Mm-hmm.
That's how long I've been studying this. And then after a certain point, after so much was coming up about Tulsa and nothing was happening about East St. Louis, plus the whole Trump era, which feels so much like the political environment that existed then. It
Yes.
felt imperative for me to tell a story. I guess 2 years ago, I've read so much, so many people have done so much good scholarship about this. I felt I didn't have to write a history book. I'm not a historian, or at least I'm a lay historian, if anything. But I thought that I had an important story to tell about my family in East St. Louis, period, but specifically about with my great grandfather's involvement as a colored policeman,
Mm-hmm.
that it was really critical that I tell this story at this time when Florida is trying to erase Black history.
Mm. Mm. Powerful. I think the final thing I'll ask you about is the silences. I think a lot about this. What we say out loud and what we don't say out loud. Like, I think it's fascinating that you knew someone who was at least close to, was your great grandmother, or was it your grandmother you said, who talked about how much they loved East St. Louis?
My grandmother, and I was very close to my grandmother.
And
And
how old was she when the riots
she
happened?
was 19.
She was 19. So it's fascinating to me when it's not mentioned, or when it is mentioned, the deeply disturbing violences aren't ever. So right now, I've talked to a descendant whose great grandmother built a raft and they went across the river.
I listened to that.
Yes, and she talked about, he talked about them throwing firebombing homes. Um, but there's still some strategic silences there. I talked to another descendant whose father was the one that W.E.B. Du Bois quoted. And his father hid, ran to Brooklyn, Illinois, hid in some trains. And his father made it a point to not really talk about it. I mean, people would mention it because he had wounds. They had shot him, this mob. Um, and it's just interesting to me what trauma won't let us say and what it will let us say.
Well, it broke up their family. She never told me about the divorce either.
Hmm.
It was really broke up their family, number one. Number two, my grandmother, by the time I was born, she had lived through three. massacres, riots.
Mm,
St. Louis, which was probably the most profound to her, you know, being right in the thick of it. The 1943 Detroit riots, and then the 1967 Detroit riots. And the 1967 ones, tanks went down the street, two houses from her. So I mean, I think that it's not unusual. It's unusual for my grandmother. My grandmother was very, she talked about a lot of things. She talked a lot about a lot of things in general, but she told me so much. She taught me so much. You know, she was an elderly woman, not a young grandmother, but an elderly grandmother when so she was talking about stuff and telling us lessons and everything. And she told us about her father and how conservative he was, but he was kind. You know, so she told me about her father. It's not like she erased that. And she told me he was a detective. She did not tell me about that. And so the kind of pain, I think you see it in slavery with people not really talking about their experiences in slavery too. I think that those traumatic things, that the way people cope and move forward with their sanity is to kind of compartmentalize and not really revisit things like that. Or it
mm,
may have been that she didn't want us to have that burden of
mm,
that kind of violence. But yeah, she never told us. She never told me. She never told my siblings. I'm trying to reach some family members that were still there so that they can talk more from a personal level. But I feel like I know enough. And so many people have written about, I mean, I Google them, they pop up.
mhm,
Um, so I also think that the story of of how they came there is important. I don't think I'm going to go like into the future, like what happened. Like I'm not going to try to bring the story to present day, at
mhm,
least in this go round, because I do think it's important how they went there, and I feel so blessed to have actually made the decision to go to East St. Louis, not just to feel the ghost,
mhm,
to see the spaces, but the people I have met with have really contextualized the brilliance, the vibrancy of the community there that existed. And even with the ghosts that still exist, maybe in the diaspora.
mhm.
I feel very connected to people I know and don't know.
Mm. Same, same. It's all ancestors all the time with me. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation that's given me a lot to think about. I'm so interested in your grandfather, and I think we might even
Great
once,
grandfather,
huh? Your
great
great grandfather. We maybe we'll have a further conversation about him over cocktails, over adult beverages again one day.